Welcome to the No More Tech Summit. Before we begin, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So firstly, this session is recorded. To all participants, your cameras and microphones are disabled. However, if you have any questions for our panelists today, please do put them into the chat because we'll try and address them all in a Q&A at the end. We are going to be covering some quite hard topics. You'll find a link in the chat to the No More Global Directory. This is a global directory of support services. If you or if anyone you know is in need of some support, please do follow that link and share it with others. Lastly, thank you for joining. We really hope that you enjoyed today's panel and we hope it's informative. So gender-based violence is taking on new forms with the rise of new technologies. Today's session, Breaking the Silence, is all about technology-facilitated gender-based violence, or what we call TFGBV for short. For those that are new to this topic, TFGBV encompasses many types of online gendered harms, from gendered hate speech to gender disinformation, non-consensual image sharing or revenge pornography, doxing, so the public release of someone's personal information like their home address or mobile number, also the tracking of individuals using tracking apps against their will. TFGBV is both personal, but also operates at scale. It affects individuals, but also societies. My name is Felicity Mulford, and I'm a research manager at the Centre for Information Resilience. The Centre for Information Resilience, or CIR for short, is a non-profit that's dedicated to exposing human rights violations and combating online behaviours that are harmful to women and other minorities. We do open source research and we publish all of our work on our website. Now, I'm joined today by 4 of my wonderful colleagues who also research gender-based violence across various countries and contexts. I'm going to let them introduce themselves now. So Mitra, if we could go to you first and then we can go around the room.
Thanks, Felicity. Hi, everyone. My name is Mitra Kutb, and I am the Relationship Manager and Communications Specialist at Afghan Witness, a project of the Center for Information Resilience. It's great to be here and discussing the TFGBV work that Afghan Witness has done alongside my other wonderful colleagues.
Hello, everyone. My name is Francesca Gentile, and I'm a researcher at CIR. I'm very excited to be here today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lucy Sharp. I'm an investigator at the Centre for Information Resilience, and I'll be talking a little bit about our Myanmar Witness project today in our session.
Hi, everyone. I'm Isabella Gomez O'Keefe. I'm a research associate at CIR. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, and I'm very excited to talking to everyone today. Over to you, Felicity.
Thanks, everyone. So today's panel is going to focus on a few key areas. We're first going to speak through our key findings from our research across various different countries that we focus on. We're going to then discuss what we think needs to be done to counter this issue, to ensure that tech is used to help and empower rather than harm. We're also going to speak a bit about what we at CIR are doing already. We're hopefully going to end on some personal reflections about what it takes to be a researcher in this field, and then we'll open to a Q&A. So as I already mentioned, if you have questions for us, please do put those into the chat and we'll try to address all of them at the end. So first, onto our key findings. I'd love to go to Mitra first. I'd love if you could tell us about your work on the erasure of women in Afghanistan. What have you found and what can you tell us today?
Thanks, Felicity. So since the Taliban takeover in 2021, Afghan women have faced severe restrictions on their rights, from access to education and employment to their freedom of movement, clothing, and the ban on showing their faces and hearing their voices. And with the street protests often suppressed, social media platforms have emerged as increasingly vital spaces for Afghan women to express their views, advocate for their rights, and raise their voices and interact with the world. But these digital platforms are not risk-free. The rise in women's online advocacy is accompanied by a rise in online abuse and harassment, which is impacting women's online and offline lives. So what we carried out a study at Afghan Witness into online gendered hate speech, targeting politically engaged Afghan women. Our team collected and analyzed 78,000 posts written in Farsi, Dari, and Pashto, which targeted politically engaged Afghan women between June to December 2021 and a similar period in 2022. We also carried out interviews with 6 Afghan women activists to gain a deeper insight into the nature of the online abuse. So what we found was severe. The investigation revealed a 217% increase, or a tripling, in posts containing gendered hate speech and abuse terms. And also the abuse was overwhelmingly sexualized. Over 60% of the posts in 2022 contained sexualized terms. And Afghan women revealed to us how they received direct messages, including pornographic content, sexually explicit photos, and threat of sexual assault, rape, and death. Women were frequently targeted with narratives of prostitution and promiscuity, as well as accused of being agents of the West and fabricating false claims to secure asylum abroad. Another finding was that Afghan women were targeted with religious, political, and ethnic abuse. We saw ethnic slurs in the comments that were addressed to politically engaged Afghan women, and also examples of gender disinformation. These included the spreading false information about the women themselves, about the discrediting the sources of their content, and creating fake accounts and pages that were then used to spread false information. In terms of perpetrators of technology-facilitated gender-based violence against politically engaged Afghan women came from a wide range of political affiliations, ethnic groups, and backgrounds, but the low-ranking Taliban members and pro-Taliban social media users, they were responsible for the majority of abuse. In terms of the impact of online abuse is severe. Has been we discovered that online abuse is connected to the real world, and it has impacted women's societal, personal, and professional lives, as well as the mental health. We noticed that the women who have faced abuse online, they have self-censored and minimized online interactions and activities. They've gone through periods of silence and reappearance, and women also reported minimizing face-to-face interactions and community events out of fears of safety. So I'll stop here, Felicity, and I think these are the main findings of the Afghan Witness research into online gender hate speech.
Thank you so much, Mitra, for that kind of frankly harrowing account of what's happening to women in Afghanistan. I think what's particularly frightening there is that coupling of the online and offline restrictions. Women have lost their space for advocacy and community building. And I think that's particularly worrying. And that actually makes me think a lot of our Myanmar Witness project. Myanmar is a country that's with an ongoing civil war. Lucy, what can we learn from you about what we've found in the context of Myanmar?
Felicity. Yeah, so I would say the impacts are very similar. CIR has been looking at the impact of online and offline kind of gendered abuse since the coup in February 2021. But through this work, we've actually been looking at technology-facilitated gender-based violence, and sometimes in collaboration with women's organizations. So a piece of research I'm going to talk about now is actually in collaboration with a great group called Sisters to Sisters. And we've been looking at politically motivated online gendered abuse, analyzing, again, the nature, the kind of impacts of the abuse, as well as the perpetrators and the survivors. So we've done this through utilizing quantitative methods, so collecting posts and content from over 100 politically engaged Telegram channels, for example. But we've also took a more qualitative approach similar to Afghan Witness, where we've talked to survivors, as well as looked at kind of thematic analysis of the content we've collected through open source for the actual detail into that. So we found that it's predominantly women expressing opinions in opposition to military rule online, or being perceived to be expressing opinions of opposition, have been targeted a lot with this kind of gendered abuse. It's not to say that that's the only people being targeted with gendered abuse. This kind of does exist in our research on both sides of the aisle, but the scope is very different. So it would be inaccurate to kind of equate the two. It's a majority pro-democracy women who are targeted. These can include, you know, activists, but also politicians we've looked at, and in general, just women online, citizens, civilians online that are either being perceived to be mocking or voicing dissent online about the military coup. Or the military in general at this point. One of the themes, I think you already highlighted in our introduction, but one of the themes that we found through our work is doxing. So the malicious and unconsensual sharing of that private and personal information about targets. This can include their names, addresses, families, or workplaces. And this can have, you know, a very silencing effect on women that Mitra already kind of talked about, where women could be withdrawing from the public space because of the threat of doxing, which can be very real. Something that we've observed before at the start of the coup even was the use of doxing to either shame, you know, Myanmar military or people associated or perceived to be associated with the Myanmar military, but also pro-democracy activists and people on the side of talking about anti-coup activity. So that's men and women, but the gender dimension was something really prevalent that we wanted to do its own kind of research on. So we've also looked at perpetrators, and the abuse is primarily from pro-military associated groups or individuals. They can use kind of more closed or insular social media platforms like Telegram, which I mentioned already, where you kind of have to be part of those groups or shared content from those groups, but it's also, you know, public memes, one would term them, but it's just thinly veiled abuse and other kind of like widely shared things on platforms like Facebook, where it's a lot more open. So I think a particularly harrowing kind of thing to talk about is by the end of 2022, there was like a 5-fold increase from gendered abuse on Telegram as compared to maybe the first week following the coup. So this kind of shows to us at least that it's not something that was happening because of the freshness of the political moment or something that's lessening over time, but something that's still prevalent for women online at the moment in Myanmar. These posts generally sexualize or shame individuals, and obviously this can either intimidate or silence women, but it also follows pro-military narratives that we've seen from the media, which can equate pro-democracy women to being morally corrupt or even racially impure. So the abusive content, while it's heavily gendered and it includes misogynistic language, it can also include homophobic language. And these narratives can, as well as being including threats of sexual violence and death, it can also serve again to instill fear, much like the doxing, and it can also enforce traditionalist gender roles, which kind of seek to suppress women's active political participation. It normalizes and trivializes sexual and gendered abuse as well. And survivors that we talk to of this kind of abuse report attacks on their person and their dignity, as well as their views, as well as things like threats of actual rape and death and violence, which can be very scary, especially again, if this is paired with that doxing method where people's real life personal information is included. So we've talked to survivors, and we also know that this can have a very psychologically damaging effect. It causes women to withdraw and silences them from online spaces and political participation, but it also can have those real world harms. The survivors we talked to also talked about offline harassment or punitive kind of actions from authorities. So it has a very broad and wide-reaching scope, regardless of if doxing is involved or not. So yeah, I think that's probably it from me.
Thanks so much, Lucy. And it's really interesting to hear that theme of silencing coming up again. You know, Mitra already mentioned it. It's come up again in your work, Lucy. And when I was thinking through the panel title for this discussion, I thought it had to have the word silence in it because it's a prominent finding across most of the contexts we work in that women are being silenced because of TF-GBV. And that's actually been one of the key findings of our work in Ethiopia as well. And now I've been fortunate enough to lead our work in Ethiopia for the last 2 years on TF-GBV. And at the very start of that program, we sat down and we spoke to women who use technology. We asked them about their experiences, and what they told us, unanimously, is that TF-GBV is incredibly prevalent across all the social media platforms that they engaged with. No platform felt safe for them. However, when these women tried to speak up about this or tried to seek help or even tried just to advocate for what was happening, they were really dismissed. People said to them, no, this is just an isolated incident. It's just you. This is not at scale. It's not a big problem. However, the lack of data on this was actually then being used to suppress their claims. So what these women told us was actually having data on this would really help to illuminate the problem and help people to understand that these aren't just isolated incidents. In fact, there's lots of people going through this problem and it's affecting society at large. So we did just that. We carried out a series of workshops and roundtables across the 2 years. We did a qualitative study, so interviews with women who've experienced online abuse to understand the narratives that are used, the techniques, the tactics. We carried out one quantitative study on Facebook, X, and Telegram looking into gendered hate speech. That was published last May. The feedback from that was, well, why didn't you look at TikTok? It's one of the worst platforms at the moment because it's rising in prevalence. So we've now expanded our research, and this month we'll be publishing our work on TikTok and YouTube, so looking at specifically gendered hate speech on those platforms. The methodology that we used in these quantitative studies, we also put through an academic rigorous test by submitting it to a journal. It's now published, so we're really happy to say that we know the methodology and the labeling tools that we've used are academically rigorous. And also we had a big conference last year in Addis where we brought together stakeholders to talk about TF-GBV. We had over 140 people in the room, including civil society actors, policymakers. We had a lot of media there. So it made it onto primetime Ethiopian TV, which we're really proud of because a year earlier the topic of TF-GBV was almost unknown. But I think the findings of this study are particularly interesting. What we found in Ethiopia is that TF-GBV is endemic. It's so normalized on social media platforms that people don't really notice that it's there. We found gendered hate speech, we found gender disinformation, we found revenge porn and sexual harassment. Like Mitra and Lucy also said, we also found threats of death, rape, and arrest. These are really quite serious things. When we dug down deeper into the specific narratives that were being used against women in Ethiopia, we found that their role in society was often at the crux of the abuse, and it was often laced with misogyny. Women who challenged traditional gender norms, they got the worst abuse of all those that we looked at. So this includes women in leadership roles, women in sports, feminists. I found the fact that women athletes got a lot of abuse really sad because, Ethiopia boasts an amazing array of female athletes, yet the way they are perceived on the internet is not very nice. When we think about how men and boys are abused compared to women and girls, we also see some quite interesting trends. For example, men and boys get abused for their political views, their affiliations, their actions, often their ethnicity as well, because Ethiopia is a very ethnically diverse country. However, women, when you look at the abuse they received, it was, their appearance, the number of sexual partners, their children, their marital status. These are very different types of abuse. And I think that became even more prominent when we started to compare specific people. So if you look at the Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, compared to the Mayor of Addis, Adanach, Abiy Ahmed gets abuse, on his political views, his stance. Adanach, the Mayor of Addis, most of the abuse says, oh, who did you sleep with to get to your position? Oh, she must be Abiy's mistress. She could never have achieved this on merit alone. There must be some other reason. So I think that really brings to life some of those different narratives in people in leadership roles. And as I mentioned, feminism is also something that's quite contested. So we found that feminism is seen as this threat to traditional values. As a result, people think it's quite a radical concept in Ethiopia. And actually, there's a movement to discredit feminists. So we see quite a lot of narratives around feminists specifically. Things like feminists are involved in financial fraud. This is all a hoax just to make their money. family. Or in even more worrying occasions, they're conflated with lesbians. Now, homosexuality in Ethiopia is illegal. So by labeling a feminist as a homosexual, this puts a target on their head. You know, they could be investigated. And actually, we see this as a real direct form of silencing, because it means that women stop advocating for women's rights because they don't want to be imprisoned. We also dug a bit deeper into the words that are used to abuse men and found some very interesting trends there, because even in specific terminology used in that abuse towards men, it often objectifies women to emasculate a man. We saw things like, he's so weak, he should be wearing a dress. We also saw things like, he's raised by a single mother. Now, this is a really common insult in Ethiopia, and it really stigmatizes single motherhood to abuse a man. You know, it's a really interesting and very layered type of abuse. There were also things like, has he got enough tampons? This type of abuse using women's reproductive health to shame men is really common. And Isabella and I are working on another project where we found that quite a lot, you know, use of female reproductive health to shame. But the consequences, we know, just don't stay online. They do span out into the real world. You know, we've heard of reports of women receiving acid attacks, you know, acid being thrown in their faces whilst walking down the street. Physical attacks, doxing. You know, one lady had to relocate her family after her address was put on the internet, and there was threats they would rape her children. You know, the psychological harm that comes with this is extreme. You know, we actually know multiple people who have now fled Ethiopia because they deem it no longer safe to live there, because their addresses are public and there are threats against their lives, or they have threats of arrest against them for speaking about women's rights. Now, overall, the impact of all of this is that women really are withdrawing from public spaces on and offline in Ethiopia, and that silencing trend is incredibly worrying. Now, I think a lot of the narratives that I just touched upon and the offline implications really link up with a lot of the work that Francesca has been doing on gender disinformation. So, Francesca, I wonder if we can come to you next. What have you found in relation to gender disinformation?
Thank you, Felicity. And yes, absolutely. To give a bit of context before jumping into the findings from our research, gender disinformation is defined as false or misleading narratives used against an individual or group due to their gender. At CIR, we've come to understand gender disinformation as a subset of TFGBV, which, as Felicity mentioned, includes other harms such as cyberstalking, image-based abuse, and sextortion, but then also as a subset of identity-based disinformation, which includes other types of disinformation that can be spread according to one's identity. So, for example, racial, ethnic, sexual, and religious disinformation. In our identity-based disinformation report, we looked at the gender disinformation being spread by state and non-state actors in several countries and contexts, including examples coming from Russia and Iran. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. So in the case of Russia, we noticed that state and non-state Russian actors frequently edited and or manipulated images of female politicians, alongside also spreading incorrect and harmful information. This is done mainly to undermine women's roles as politicians, spread animosity towards them, and discourage women from taking on political careers. Kremlin-affiliated media outlets have shared manipulated images of Germany's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock, claiming that she was once a professional prostitute. They've disseminated both false information and manipulated images of Ukrainian MP Svetlana Zelishchuk. And in this case, they shared a fake post with the claim that the MP would run naked down Kiev Main Street if Ukraine lost a key battle. And then lastly, a manipulated image of former Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin consuming drugs was also shared online. In the case of Iran, we noticed that both Iranian state and non-state actors spread false and harmful narratives against high-profile Iranian women who live outside the country and are active in media, human rights, and women's rights activities. Once again, the intent of these perpetrators is to undermine, shame, silence, and damage the reputation of these women. In the case of Iran, the narratives are typically very vulgar, seeking to create a strong and lasting negative psychological impact on the audience's perception of that individual. So, for example, Iranian media channels spread fabricated claims that a female BBC Persian presenter had been raped by a male colleague. As a consequence of this, the presenter was shamed and questioned on live TV. In the case of Iran, plausibility and providing evidence do not seem to be the primary concern of the perpetrators spreading these narratives. But in reality, the focus is more on damaging a woman's reputation and silencing them. And that's it from our side on the gender disinformation.
Thank you, Francesca. I think let's turn straight to Isabella, who also works on gender disinformation, and she's one of the authors of our gender disinformation playbook. So, Isabella, what have you found during your research?
Amazing. Thank you, Felicity. A lot of what we found actually built on our IBD report that Francesca just highlighted. One of the main focuses is that we wanted to better understand the tools, tactics, and techniques that contribute to TFGBV. One of the main ways you see this is social media has provided tools which can be weaponized to enable TFGBV. One thing that has been mentioned or researched before is the use of fake accounts, for example, to embarrass or humiliate a high-profile woman, for example, maybe a journalist, to kind of humiliate them. One of the tools we focused on in our report specifically was generative AI, which has been an interest in the field generally recently. We have begun to see generative AI used to target high-profile women. For example, the Rolling Stone recently published a piece highlighting how AOC had been targeted by deepfake porn. It's also important to assess what the future of AI is going to look like in terms of TFGBV. So the impact as it becomes more accessible and advanced, how will it be used for harm and how can we combat that? Another one I wanted to highlight was the indirect tools and ways that social media has been used for TFGBV. So one of the things that we found is that in some ways there can become a culture where TFGBV can be promoted and reproduced by others. Especially in cases where there's an identity-based culture online. For example, many scholars have talked about the manosphere, where it's particularly based in masculinities. So one of the examples that I would see often is I would see a high-profile account on TikTok, for example, post something attacking a female politician or an individual. And then one of the ways that it will be boosted is through high numbers of likes and comments and shares and other interactions, which then might boost its visibility. Then the comment section would often repeat the narratives, often using the same verbiage even. But then you even see other creators start to make similar posts which do similar attacks, and you see the comments in those making similar attacks, and even comments on videos that aren't relevant sometimes having those attacks, or even on different platforms. So it becomes like almost a viral sensation at some points. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the different tactics. So one of the things that some of the other experts on this panel have talked about is doxing or dogpiling, and these can make individuals feel overwhelmed. They can be a threat to their online safety and also their offline safety. Another common tactic that we've been seeing more and more recently that I wanted to highlight was the use of evasive language. This has been referred to as different things by different experts. The Wilson Center had a great report called Malign Creativity, which talked about this. Extremist research have called this dog whistles and talked about kind of evasive language online. And as the Wilson Center pointed out in their original report, this is a way of using coded language to attack women or individuals in a way that evades content moderation and that won't be taken down. This type of language is also used to help signify in-group identities and bolster that. So it's almost a way of speaking in code for certain groups. And it can look a lot of different ways. So there can be stuff like intentional misspellings. So someone might call a female politician a slut, but spell it with a $sign, so it doesn't get taken down, or the use of memes, nicknames, and other evasive language. For example, if you were going to make a threat against somebody, you might not say, I'm going to kill them. You'd say, I'm going to unalive them. In that way, you're able to make that threat without it being caught. So as this kind of shows us, it's not only difficult to moderate, but it can be difficult to research because it's quickly evolving. So people are quickly learning what's being taken down. And as they do get taken down, new things start to come out. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the different narratives. So a lot of these have already been talked about by people on this panel, but one of the things that we see is that these narratives are often homogenizing and help create and call on pre-existing stereotypes about women in general. So women might be called weak, emotional, unfit for work, and often they're targeted for their physical attributes. They also build on deeply embedded social, cultural, moral, and political norms. For example, one of the ones we talk about in our report is the motherhood conundrum. So this is the idea that women are penalized both for being mothers, but also for not having children. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was a bit more on what Felicity mentioned, which was this anti-feminist narrative. So this is a good narrative which shows us how loss and threat are weaponized within TFGBV to kind of make it a more evocative narrative and resonate with people more. So in this specific example, feminism is used to portray threat to men and masculinity. And then finally, I was going to talk about basically one of the examples that I saw that kind of illuminated this in my own research. So in the lead up to the US election, I particularly saw a lot of this towards Kamala Harris since she was in the public eye. So people often claimed that she was unqualified and that she slept her way to the top. Again, calling back to these narratives and especially moral codes by insinuating that she was promiscuous. It was not only widely circulated, but it was reproduced by many different accounts of different sizes. And these accounts would go viral at times. And there was the use of many coded names, such as calling her Kamala or making sexually implicit or explicit references to her knees, certain emojis, and even meme coded talk. And I think that's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Isabella. And I think the thing I'm taking away from like everyone's key findings is that there are lots of overlapping narratives, lots of overlapping techniques and targets, and the impacts are quite overlapping as well. You know, the shaming, the discrediting, the sexualizing, and silencing women. We see that across all of our work. You know, TFGBV clearly transcends borders and contexts, you know, and cultures. I think I'm going to pivot the conversation now. I'd really love to hear from each of you about what you think needs to be done to ensure that tech is used to help and empower rather than harm. And what are we at CIR already doing? So Mitra, let's start with you and then we can go around the room.
Thanks, Felicity. So I would like to note some of the recommendations of our TFGBV research at Afghan Witness. First of all, we think it's key to increase Afghan women's digital security knowledge to make sure that they feel safe online, and also raise awareness on how to use social media safely, how to efficiently protect one's identity, and how to spot fake news. Platform accountability is very important as well. Social media platforms should take more steps to protect women online, promote accountability, and tackle the culture of impunity regarding gendered hate speech. I'd also like to note that expanding language capabilities of social media platforms for monitoring hate speech is important. Monitoring and taking down hate speech in other languages, dialects, and local contexts is needed. In terms of what we have done, we have conducted a series of consultations with partner organizations that revealed the very important need of the community, and that is the need for protecting and promoting digital platforms for women. We have developed digital and personal safety resources designed to protect, to support women, activists, and female students seeking online education. We have translated these resources into local languages. We have delivered trainings on digital and personal security to organizations who needed it. We clearly see high demand for these sorts of knowledge sharing. And we also have some tailored collaborations with organizations. For example, we're working with an organization called Afghan Education Student Outreach Project, or ASOP, an organization focused on delivering online education for girls. They would like to transform the safety booklet that we have developed into a digital video series for students to be integrated as a course module on its learning platform. Another example is that we are working with ICON to develop comprehensive workshops on digital and personal security for Afghan women. So these are the sorts of collaborations that we are doing, and we are expanding this type of work.
For me, I think to ensure that technology is used to help and empower instead of harm, I think what needs to be done is raise awareness about these topics and the research that is being carried out. At CIR, for example, we aim to raise awareness about our research either by publishing reports on our website, collaborating with media, and or even taking part in or hosting events. And all of these are very important, as reaching and engaging with a broader audience is key for raising awareness on these topics. Another useful outcome in terms of using technology to help and empower are, as Mitra mentioned, trainings. And there are other trainings that CIR carries out, including trainings on vicarious trauma and trauma-informed interview techniques. And these are really important as they ensure both the safety and well-being of our researchers as well as of our partners. In the case of vicarious trauma trainings, we've actually published on our website our internal guidelines on how to handle traumatic content. And what's important about these guidelines is really to make sure that the researchers and investigators carrying out this type of research feel prepared, but also, and more importantly, safe to do so.
Amazing. For me, I would say very similar to Francesca, that I think communication and education and awareness is a big part of it. So communication on social media could be a tool to challenging TFGBV. I think when we think about the root causes of TFGBV, we have to understand that the perpetrators have in many ways mastered and exploited these communicative functions of social media, which is why they're so prominent. They understand the platforms, at times, they understand how to go viral and what to say, and that's why it's becoming so pervasive in some instances. But I think that even though this is a negative element of TFGBV, it can also show some potential for positive change. If the communicative functions of social media can be harnessed to educate people and bring awareness and activism, then that could help a lot. I think this is big for researchers by just making sure that they understand the culture of social media and the communication styles that are happening. And also from a policy perspective and understanding the environment themselves and where these attacks are taking place. I think also another way we can do this is trying to communicate in the ways that we know are successful. So using influencers, big names, social media style communication, and trying to get a big audience and to bring awareness. Also, a big part of this is taking these big complex ideas that we're spending so much time researching and making them digestible so that they can be understood on social media. And I think social media in many ways has already shown this to be quite successful in a space that can be used for this. For example, we've already seen lots of education and activism around specific women's rights movements, such as the Women Life Freedom Movement in Iran and the reaction to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And now I will give it to Lucy.
Thank you, Isabella. Kind of maybe going back to something that Francesca mentioned within training and awareness raising, I think for me, what comes under that is a need for the multi-stakeholder approach and collaboration between lots of different entities when we're looking at combating technology-facilitated gender-based violence. It can be effective in empowering individuals to be safe online and fighting those issues. And that collaboration can come with collaboration with victims and including victims' voices, obviously, but also working with partners. I mean, in the conflict setting that our witness is looking at, working with partners and community groups on the ground, as well as policymakers, if we can. And kind of vitally, I guess a through line here is social media platforms. They play a big role in being able to craft effective strategies against hate speech that permeate online spaces. So to kind of reiterate some of the other experts' points on the panel, working with these groups, we can do things like training in open source and empowering groups that are researching this specifically, or training them in how to kind of research this specific area, as well as providing funding and some of the other things that Myanmar Witness takes very seriously on our side. For researchers specifically, I would say our work doesn't usually begin without an end point, right? So we're thinking a lot what our research aims are. Is it platform accountability? Is it policy? In the end, it's making spaces online safer for everyone, women, minorities, men, everyone who's engaging there. So collaborating with social media platforms to alert them of the things going on in their platforms is something that we try to make connections on. We can, that way we can have some accountability that might not, in the situation of Myanmar, come from governments or identifying actual actors online. Our methodologies are kind of incredibly important here. We're conducting this research thinking about how we can more effectively communicate with platforms. The example I mentioned before of our research in Myanmar, we made sure that when we were doing our qualitative research on thematic analysis, those pieces of content that we've collected, we're identifying exactly what platform policy they're violating. And that way, when we're going to platforms, we can also present them not only with our own analysis and our research on the major themes, but very specific, granular, why this is a problem, what the themes are, what the trends look like, so that that work can also be proactive in the future. And that kind of has the effect of making our job easier. It makes, well, not necessarily easier, it's a lot more work, but making it easier for platforms to be able to work with us and effectively craft those strategies. Yeah. I would say.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for those answers. And I think it shows that we probably need a multi-pronged approach, because I think each of them sounded really important and cover a lot of different angles. And I think for me, education is one of the primary things. You know, when we sat down with individuals in our workshops in Ethiopia to discuss the findings, we always asked, how do we have impact with this? How do we make change? And education was always the first thing people said. You know, we would need to educate the key perpetrators and those that engage with technology to understand how to communicate in kind ways online. So I think what would be fantastic, just because I'm aware of time, I'd love to quickly hear your reflections working as researchers on this topic. If we could keep these kind of quite brief so that we have time for some questions at the end. So a reminder, if you have questions for us, please do put them in the chat. And when I say reflection, what I'd love to hear is, you know, how do you experience this as a researcher? You know, for example, from my perspective, one of my key barriers when I talk about TFGBV or I'm researching it is that people often separate the online space from the real world. You know, we know that online harms have offline consequences, and we know that offline events can impact online discourse. So we know that these two spaces are intrinsically linked, they're not separate. And actually, the online space is a real space. You know, it's part of our everyday lives. So we need people to understand this so that they take responsibility for how they act in these online spaces. So I think that's one of my key reflections, but I'd love to just go around the room, keep it quite brief, and maybe start with Isabella.
Awesome. Mine is quite similar to yours, Felicity. It's that I don't think you can separate the research or TFGBV generally from politics, culture, and society. It's often segmented, treated as a separate issue, but it's deeply connected to all these things and it has to inform the work. I think we see this in a couple different ways. So in research design, this should be at the forefront of how we're designing our research and thinking about how we can reflect that from a response, so policy, and also from even funding and what projects we look at. And then I just wanted to also say that it's an issue that cuts across societies. So we're kind of unified, but that, yeah, remembering that we're all kind of facing this.
As you also noted, Isabella and Felicity, online space and offline lives are really linked with each other, especially in the situation of Afghanistan with the severe restrictions and discriminatory policies that Taliban have put in place targeting women. It is very important that we support women of Afghanistan through digital initiatives, mitigate risks of online participation, and help them connect to the world through digital initiatives and through digital platforms, as we cannot allow the complete erasure of women from the public life and from the media and the normalization of what women of Afghanistan are going through in the online and offline platforms. And I'd also like to reiterate that it is key that tech companies also support women of Afghanistan and mitigate the risk of online participation and increase safety for women of Afghanistan and all women around the world. I think it's very important.
I think the most important outcome for me when carrying out this research is to raise awareness on topics that are at times overlooked, and in a way try and give a voice to those that might not have it. So I worked on the Afghan Witness Gendered Hate Speech report that Mitra was talking about, and the findings from it were really important. because they did bring to light the abuse that Afghan women face online, but also, and more importantly, the impact that this has had for women offline. So once again, reiterating what we've all said, it's very important to raise awareness on how the online and offline spheres are interconnected.
Yeah, I would just kind of reiterate the point the panel has already said. For the Myanmar Witness work that we look at, the silencing effects for women and minorities online, being able to advocate online is extremely harmful. Historically, this has been a really important part of understanding the current conflict in Myanmar, pre-coup, post-coup, and advocacy for those affected. So in my view, if half the population is becoming very uncomfortable reporting on any human rights violations or kind of advocating in that way, we as researchers and open source researchers, we're unable to support the work of advocates and civilians on the ground effectively. So it's really important in all of the work we do. We look at the gender dimensions, whether it's online or offline impacts that we're looking at. Similar to what Mitra said, we can't let normalization of harmful views and the treatment of women permeate online, nor the shrinking of online spaces for women, because advocacy is so important in these conflict settings, and harmful perceptions of women do have those real world effects. So I would say from that is my takeaway from this side.
Thank you, Mitra, Isabella, Francesca, and Lucy for those reflections and for being here with me today to talk about this topic. Hopefully through these types of discussions, we are helping to kind of break that silence about TFGBV and show the public about, what we're working on. So we thank, Know More for having us here and providing a platform where we can talk about this issue that's really important to us all. We have roughly 10 minutes left, so I would love to move to a Q&A. So if you have any questions for us, please do put them in the box. We'll take a few at a time if there are any. I will pause for a moment and let some questions come in, but please do ask anything you'd like. This is just the start of the conversation. We are all here and willing to answer your questions either today or at a later date. But yeah, please feel free to put some questions into the box and we'll take a few at a time. While we wait for questions, I just thought I'd quickly address one that has already been answered by the Know More team. There's a question about resources or initiatives for helping men become allies. One of the really cool initiatives that we're just about to begin at CIR is the co-development of a toolkit with an Ethiopian civil society group. And that toolkit is going to address what is TFGBV in the context of Ethiopia, what is hate speech, how do we improve media literacy. There'll be components about vicarious trauma, digital security, research methods, lots of different components. And the idea is we can then use that toolkit to train men and boys to identify and react to this and help to combat it. So in a few years' time, I'll share with you that resource, but it's something to keep an eye out for. But yeah, thank you to Carmen for that question. We've got one question in here now, so I'm going to quickly raise it with the group, and please feel free to put your hand up or come in directly to answer that. So we have an anonymous attendee that's asked, what is the biggest challenge in addressing TFGBV? So to the panelists, who would like to go first? Please do, Lucy.
I'm happy to talk a little bit about this. Maybe I don't know if it would be the biggest challenge, because there's many challenges, but I think maybe, and it kind of links to the first question, demystifying what technology facilitated gender-based violence can be. For example, I think Felicity, you mentioned as well in your Ethiopia work, something that we did see and we see in our Myanmar Witness work is that sometimes the presentation of hate speech or gendered abuse can come in the form of, things people might see as humorous posting or free speech about something that could actually be gendered disinformation. So I think it's really important that we can have evolving terminology and look at the way that these things are affecting, and kind of something that we might see as humorous could actually have a real world effect of reinforcing traditional gender roles or harmful ideas for women or minorities or whoever we're looking at. So just making sure that we're always open to learning and researching and kind of seeing what comes up in our research about what constitutes this kind of gendered abuse.
Yeah, I think, Lucy, that really aligns with what Isabella was saying earlier about things evolving. You know, I think we've seen that in just a couple of years of researching the topic. We can see this changing all the time. Francesca, over to you.
I was going to agree with Lucy because I think evolving terminology is really important, and Isabella and I have seen it in some of our other work, how important it is, especially online, how certain words can be manipulated and how some might only be used, and again, going to what Isabella was saying, might only be used by a certain group to reinforce their group identity. So some emojis that might seem innocent could be used by certain groups into spreading hate speech or other sort of narratives. And on top of that, I think, again, sort of Lucy touched upon this, just talking about the topic. So raising awareness and just having, conducting events, again, going back to what I said, publishing research, conducting events, just to make sure that this topic is talked about and understood better.
Thanks, Francesca. Mitra, over to you.
I'll be very brief. I think one of the challenges would be the language capabilities of tech platforms, because different variations of some hateful words are used in different languages and different dialects. So it is key to increase or raise the tech capabilities and expand the language capabilities of tech platforms to include those dialects and to detect hate speech and deactivate accounts, or promote accountability for the in digital and social media platforms. I think that's also very it's a bit challenging researching TF-GBV in different contexts and languages.
Yeah, I really resonate with what you've just said, Mitra. You know, even I think Ethiopia has more than 80 languages, maybe 60 plus of those are online. You know, even in our work, we struggled to cover enough languages. We had 4 in our study, which was a real lift. And that's only 4 of what 60 that are online. And they were the 4 most widely spoken languages online. And even those content moderation tools are not picking up some of the most offensive language in those languages. So yeah, I think that's definitely something we need to be looking into and investing in. Like, tech platforms need to invest in content moderation in what we call low resource languages. And I think the moves with the current tech platforms direction away from third-party fact checkers is something that really concerns me greatly, because actually in contexts like Ethiopia, automated content moderation doesn't work. And actually there was a reliance upon this third-party level of fact checking, even if it was in a very small amount anyway. I'm going to ask the next question that we have in here, which is, what can people do in their everyday lives? I'm actually going to ask 2 questions because we've only got 5 more minutes. So I think we'll do just maybe one more answer each. So what can people do in their everyday lives? And what tech companies are doing when it comes to combating this? And are there any good policies to look at? So let's answer those, and then we'll try and bring this session to a close.
I'm happy to answer a little bit from maybe the everyday lives question, but something that I think is really important is actually calling out or being able to report, or if you taking the time that when you're online and you're seeing, because I think it's very common for people to actually see this kind of abuse. Maybe if you're on Instagram and you're looking at reels and you're seeing, someone's posted something very benign, but some of the comments might be from anonymous random, maybe they're bot accounts, maybe they're real, but posting abuse. This is something that every person who is online can have an effect on by using reporting functions, by calling out this kind of work and not letting a space become a hostile space. In fact, making it hostile towards, not making it hostile, the wrong word, but kind of making sure that you can address this yourself by reporting or calling out when you see instances of this kind of abuse. And also just questioning, again, going back to the point I raised in the last question, questioning if this could be constituted as abuse in any way, gendered abuse. Something that you might see as kind of a benign statement about a female politician online could be either, misinformation about that politician, or perhaps aiming to kind of degrade them. So making sure that you're kind of plugged into those evolving definitions as well, and questioning everything you see always.
Yeah, and I think that feeds into that whole free speech debate that we're always stuck in, right? Because the kind of criticism when people want to report stuff is people say, oh, I had my free speech, I can say what I like. But actually, there needs to be a limit. And as we know in international law, free speech is a limited right. You know, actually, we want to make sure that these spaces are nice for women and girls. Francesca, let's come to you now, and then we might have to we might run out of time for the last questions. So over to you, Francesca.
I agree with what Lucy said on sort of what can be done every day. And I think another good thing that can be done is just reading reports or reading what is out there on the topic. I have learned so much just by reading all the different reports that we have done at CIR. And I've learned things that I had no idea existed before. So it's good to be able to just keep gathering knowledge and expanding in a way knowledge, and sort of seeing that there is at times an overlap between these sort of different countries and different contexts.
Yes, yeah, we have one more question here that asks if we could extend the program in Ethiopia to Kenya. I'd love to. So if you want to get in touch, please do reach out to us. I think our contact details should be available on the Know More website. But I'm really aware that our time is coming to a close. So I'd just like to take a moment to say a really big thank you to the panelists who joined me today. So to Mitra, Isabella, Francesca, and Lucy, for taking the time to share your experiences and reflect on the work that you've done over the last few years at the Centre for Information Resilience. But we'd also like to say a really big thank you to the Know More team for having us here. It's been amazing to be part of your Tech Week. We really are very grateful that you gave us a space to talk about this work, and it's been a really big pleasure to be here with you all. As I said, I hope this is just the start to many of these conversations, so if you'd like to reach out to any of us, please do get in touch. I can see there are a few questions we didn't answer, so I will write them down, and if you want to get in touch, we can go through those at another date. But yes, a huge thank you to everyone involved in making this Tech Week happen, including the behind the scenes tech team, and we thank you very much for your time. Thank you.